So we are live now, and I am removing.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Damayanti Bhattacharya from Voyages into the Past. Today, we are very honored to have with us Professor Samita Sen, the Ware Hemsworth Professor of Imperial and Naval History from University of Cambridge. Professor Sen received her Ph.D. from Cambridge and was a junior research fellow at Trinity College. She has taught at Calcutta and Jadavpur University and was the first Vice-Chancellor of Diamond Harbour Women's University. She also worked as the Dean, Faculty of Interdisciplinary Studies in Jadavpur University from 2016 to 2018. Aside from being an esteemed teacher, Professor Sen is also an author of various publications. Her writings extensively focus on gender and labor. Her monograph, Women and Labor in Late Colonial India, published from Cambridge University Press, won the Trevor Reese Prize in Commonwealth History. She has edited works like Capital in the East, Revolutions of Mars. Her area of specialization is colonial South Asia, but she has also done contemporary and interdisciplinary research on issues such as domestic violence and labor in the informal sector. She is a member of editorial boards of various journals, including Modern Asian Studies and South Asian History and Culture. She edited Global South, Sephis magazine. She has been a member of Shochetana, a voluntary association of women, since 1983 and has participated in both governmental and non-governmental fora of Beijing Conference in 1995. Professor Sen is very active in women's movement and is a strong supporter of women empowerment at both national and international scale.
Should I start, Damayanti? Hello.
Yes,
Can
ma'am,
you?
please go ahead. The stage
Yeah.
is yours.
Thank you, Damayanti. That was a very generous introduction from you. So today we will speak about wives and workers. This is a preliminary work that I'm doing for an edited volume. And in this talk today, I will examine how the 19th century world of labor looks when we see it through the lens of gender. In doing this, I will pay very special attention to marriage as an institution for gendering labor, which provided crucial linkages between productive and reproductive labor. In the first major exploration of this subject, Professor Nirmala Banerjee, who wrote an article in the very famous book Recasting Women, she spoke about two tropes, modernization and marginalization. In this paper, I will not speak of marginalization separately. Just to note that this is also a very important trope, and there are two major occupations of women which are eroding, which are declining steadily in the 19th and 20th centuries. One is food processing, and one is mainly spinning, but many things to do with the cotton industry, artisan occupations in the cotton industry. This essay today, the paper, will look through three frames. It will discuss first the gender composition of early industrial labor. It will then discuss the significant role migration played in the constitution of wage labor and the gendering of industrial workforce. In the case of women, marriage played a crucial role, as one may easily understand, in determining women's immobility or mobility, whichever way you look at it, and this will be discussed in some detail. These relationships, it will be argued in the third section, helps us understand the vast worlds of domesticity, domestic labor, and sexual labor, which have been marginal in most conventional accounts of labor in South Asia. And this is what will be new in looking at labor through the gender lens. So let's start with industrial labor. In India, as in many other countries, the first modern factories came in textiles. The two major industries in major cities of the country, east and west, were cotton textile industry in Bombay and jute industry in Calcutta. In most parts of the world, Britain, Europe, USA, even in Asia, China, and Japan, cotton textile factories employed women and children. In China and Japan, unlike in Europe and USA, these were young women, child and adolescent workers who worked before marriage, contributing to their natal homes and towards the cost of their marriage, dowries, for instance. After marriage, they left work and concentrated on housewifery and childcare, returning to the workforce in exceptional circumstances, in the absence or inadequacy of male earnings, though these exceptions may have been rather more frequent than usually imagined. Now, this was not the case in India. In India, first, textile industries did not employ a majority of women. Even in Madurai, where the gender regime was more flexible, which we know from the writings of Shobhana Warrior, the maximum proportion of women in the workforce was about a quarter to a third. This is also true of Bombay. Bengal's jute never had more than a quarter, even though its only major counterpart in Dundee became a women's town. So great was the industry's preference for women. Calcutta jute did not employ women to the same extent. In traditional cotton textiles, as it is well known, there was a strong taboo against women weaving. This taboo teleported itself into modern mills, both cotton and jute. However, traditionally, spinners were women. In modern mills, the taboo on women extended to spinning also. Only child labor, usually male child labor, predominated in the subfield in spinning departments, which was called doffing. But there is another important way in which Indian textile industries were unique in their gender composition. That is to say, there was no unmarried women in industry. Most women were married, but even more than married women were widows. So industry was predominated by widows, and widows were in fact not only predominant in industry, they were a very large part of the population, much more so than in most other countries. And this is obvious reasons. The average age of marriage was very low. In Eastern India, in the period we are talking about, the average age of marriage would have been 7 to 10. The country average was not much more. So among women, the proportion of married women were 99%. Everybody was married. So there was no young adolescent unmarried women in the population. In the coal mines established in 1884-85, we found a lot of employment of women. They grew rapidly, especially in the Raniganj area. At first, workers came from neighboring districts. In Bengal, local labor remained more significant, with migration decelerating over time. The participation of Adivasi workers declined over the early 20th century. Very few of them converted to full-time mining labor. A range of other low castes entered mining work. By the mid-1930s, only 2% of coal mine labor in Bengal was migrant. The distinctive feature of mining labor was the family gang system, in which men, women, and children worked as a unit. The assumption was the assumption at the base of this unit was in fact the family, when in reality a large proportion of unrelated men, women, and children also worked in the gang system. In the Bihar case, with increasing significance of single male migrants, this was more the case. Moreover, from 1910 and for the next 2 decades, the numbers of single women workers, such as widows, deserted women, also grew. According to Dheeraj Knight, there were 4 subtypes within the family gang. There was first the family unit of husband, wife, and children. Second, there was a cohabitational unit of men and women, which included children of both or either. Third, there were single women minors with or without child. And last, there were single men minors who had left their families back in their own village. In the Raniganj collieries, according to Dagmar Kurgel, who wrote a report about it in 1923, Santali men worked with wives or female relatives, while there were also low-caste women who worked either as part of family units or who lived and worked with single men. In this period, Santali and Bauri women were the most numerous. She noted that Bauri women alone were found to be living without male protection, working in the gang system with unrelated men. There was virtually no participation of women from higher or intermediate castes or Muslims in mining work. While Kurgel was very critical of the consequences of these working conditions, Kamini Roy, who visited the mills around the same time in 1923, romanticized the family system. She reported that the women preferred to work underground with their men because there was great anxiety about safety. She also commented on the durable nature of marriages with a sharing of joys and privations, even though there were a few cases of divorce. In the early 1920s, there were about 15,000 women in mines, constituting about 35%, both among the surface and underground labor. The question of women labor attracted considerable controversy in this period when the ILO proposed a prohibition on women working underground. It had been in discussion because in the UK, in Great Britain, underground work by women had been prohibited in the mid-19th century, in 1842. When such a measure was first proposed in India, there was opposition because it was felt it would disrupt the deployment of the gang system. In 1923, however, mine owners had to concede to the prohibition of children under 13 years working underground, which caused difficulties for women workers with young children. In 1901, the total proportion of the female workforce in underground work was 63%, but by 1929, it had declined to 34%. More than 90% of underground women mine workers were, however, in the coal mines. Women were gradually removed from underground work and finally banned in 1929. By 1938, women constituted only 11% of underground workers. But this debate takes us well into the 20th century. For our purpose today, it is important to note that the gang system was not equal to the family system. In the gang system, the wage was usually paid to the man who headed the gang, but women were entitled to 40% of the wage. This meant that women earned 8 to 12 annas per day. Nevertheless, these wages were double or even more of what women earned in surface work. Thus, surface women lived in relative poverty compared to women in underground work. Thus, reformers such as Kamini Roy, who may have romanticized women miners and the family system, testified that women in underground work were better off on many counts, and that such work was not harmful for them. The evidence indicates that 1/3 of women in gangs were single women, and the higher wages were no doubt critical for their well-being. The prohibition of underground work meant dire poverty for such single women since they could not get surface jobs in such numbers in the short term. Dheeraj Knight argued that the gangs were based on the family, even if not in the narrow sense of the term, in a wider sense, in the communitarian family. By this, he describes clustering in terms of caste or territory and argues that when men and women worked together, they were from the same social group defined by the communitarian family. While this may have been true, there is no evidence that the communitarian family provided support to single women after they lost their underground jobs. Dagmar Engels, on the other hand, argues that mining provided women greater economic scope and flexibility. This was especially the case with women who had access to a plot of land in the mining settlement. It provided a crucial source of supplementary income. As a result, there was less indebtedness among women miners. Another key advantage was the possibility of rising to supervisory levels, which was not there in mills or plantations. So the mines provided a very limited, but still an opportunity for upward mobility. A few women in coal mines achieved considerable power and prestige in the workplace as sardarnis. As in all other industries, however, even such women were paid less than men in equivalent positions. The prohibition of underground work for children and then women was a setback for mining families in general, lowering their family income. Um, but it had disastrous consequences for women headed families who were not able to fall back upon a man's wage. So there are different but related issues with other mines. We need a lot more research on these subjects. We know very little about women's roles in different capitalist enterprises in the late 19th century, especially the smaller enterprises. But what we do have in terms of very disparate facts tell us that we can connect the study of labor with the study of social reform. For whatever reason, marriage has been seen as a problem of the elite articulated within social reform and is the primary subject of gender history. And it has not been an issue for labor historians. At the same time, complicated questions of work involved in the constitution of the Bhadra Mahila, the material basis of change in women's work and the nature of capitalist transaction, reproduction, and accumulation have not been addressed at all. All this is very unfortunate. There has been too little conversation between women and gender history and labor history. And yet, without taking gender into account, we cannot understand developments in the field of labor in the 19th and 20th century. This failure has had enormous consequence for strategies of collectivization and labor politics. Equally, marriage reform, extensively analyzed by historians of gender, cannot be understood if you don't understand its implications for work. And I've said this before, Aditya Sarkar in his new book has addressed this a little bit, but we need to do a little more work on this, which is that 1891 is the year when you have both the age of consent debate and the Factories Amendment Act. What do these connections mean? From 1880s to 1911, there was a series of debates on the conditions under which children should work in factories. And there was the creation of a category called adolescent workers. In this entire debate, child and adolescents were considered to be male. Female workers were always women. The relationship between a low age of marriage, the absence of the concept of girlhood, and the ways this fundamentally shaped the gender constitution of labor is yet to be understood. I would argue that the discourses of protective legislation cannot be analyzed without drawing these connections. It is a matter of serendipity, perhaps, that the age of consent and the Factories Act was exactly contemporaneous. In fact, they were passed one after the other. But what, and we have not discovered any connection between the two. But nevertheless, there is a need to connect these two debates, and we should try and understand what is the key link between early marriage and the Indian woman worker as a married mother, which is what Professor Nirmala Banerjee, who I started this talk with, has brought to our attention. I wish to highlight that the links between marriage systems and social reproduction with the labor market remains many and varied, and with histories in sometimes known but unexpected places. So my second question will be connecting marriage with migration. Ever since counting began, successive census reports have noted that women outstrip men as migrants, their proportion having held at more or less a steady 70% of total migrants for over a century now, that we have figures for. This is attributed to marriage and the culture of village exogamy, a strategy to separate young brides from their natal kin and enhance patriarchal control. The contradiction this presents, that women are all compulsory migrants at marriage only to be immobilized by marriage, has not been seen as a puzzle in migration literature or for labor historians. Moreover, marriage migration is seen as a one-way journey. Even the rituals and ceremonies elaborate the alienation of the bride from her natal kin. We all know the ritual of throwing that bit of rice over your shoulder when a daughter leaves her natal home after marriage. In fact, in reality, and this will be evident to everybody who's listening, women circulate between natal and conjugal family. This may follow an annual calendar, which is sentimentally portrayed through the Durga Puja in Bengal, or it may be marked by life cycle rituals such as childbirth. So women return to their natal home for reasons of childbirth, widowhood, incompatibility, or a second subsequent marriage by the husband. Thus, the marriage system itself ensures circulation of women on a scale unmatched by any other form of circularity, including all of those of men. The circulation of married women was not devoid of labor content, though this varied enormously across class, caste, and region. Indeed, even women's labor migration over short distances often outstripped men's. In rural circulation, for instance, they were often preponderant. Work has been done on this, especially for the period of the immediate post-colonial period, and a lot of work was done in 1980s, which people have kind of not incorporated in migration studies as much as they could have. The 19th century witnessed a massive mobilization of labor in India. There were 4 strands in the colonial period: overseas indentured migration within India, mining, which was short-term and commuting migration. Numerically, the largest migration was rural-urban migration. And there was also migration to industrial enterprises. All these forms of migration included women, but to varying extent and with varying degrees of deliberate mobilization, attended by more or less controversy. While in rural-urban migration and early years of overseas migration, there was a domination of single male migration. In all these forms of migration, there was some also family migration. And to colonial officers, an index of permanence was the scale of family migration. Obviously, single migration of men and women was often regarded as temporary. My research has shown that migration of single women tended to be more permanent than that of single men. A policy of directed recruitment of women was most evident among planters. Women constituted little less than half, for instance, in Assam tea plantations, and one-third in overseas migration, which were also for plantations, sugar, rubber. I have argued elsewhere that an Orientalist conviction in the self sufficient village community led the Indian peasantry to being regarded as inherently immobile. This stereotype impinged more on women, given the dominant values of women's seclusion and gender segregation. This led to considerable attention being paid to the instruments of mobilization to achieve desirable levels of migration. Thus, what emerged as crucial in this period was the question of intermediation. The literature on migration in the colonial period emphasizes informal modes of mobilization along axes of family, caste, and community. The major contrast to such migration is indentured migration, which was assisted. Even within forms of assisted migration, however, there was a perceived dichotomy between informal modes of recruitment and formal commercial recruitment. The commercial recruitment of workers was symbolized in the opprobrious figure of the Arkati, who came to represent a mode of mobilization approximate to trafficking. The commercial agencies are supposed to have bought labor by payment of advances, met the costs of travel to their workplace, and sold them to the employers for profit. This is obviously sounds like slavery. This was sometimes literally the case, since the payment of advances were made not to the worker but to others who could enable or influence recruitment, such as heads of household, fathers, husbands, mothers, elder kin, village chiefs, influential personages in the locality. The advance then became like a price of purchase. Moreover, recruits were often deceived, misinformed, or coerced, which made all kinds of migration look very much like trafficking. This applied especially to the recruitment of women. These sharply drawn dichotomies have diverted attention from linkages and connections within various forms of recruitment. Much can be said about this. Fraud and deceit was always part of all forms of intermediation in all kinds of migration, including, in case of women, forms of marriage that led to their sale to recruiters, which we now see very clearly. I will speak a little about this in the next section. But now in the media, we hear a lot about bride trafficking. Bride trafficking is not a new phenomenon. In the case of women, marriage became the cornerstone of controversy. Charges of kidnapping brought against recruiters by members of the family failed because women and adolescents professed willingness to migrate. Thus, the distinction between legal and actual kidnapping began to vanish. There was a troubling question of consent. The patriarchal family, threatened by the possibility of women abandoning home and children, was able to win over a section of colonial official opinion to delegitimize women and children exercising agency in migration decisions. At the same time, plantocracy's productive and reproductive exigencies dictated the incorporation of women into wage labor. They argued, in the voice of officialdom, for greater freedom for women in migration decisions. So you have a strange debate. The question of women's migration was shaped within this cusp, which drew not only from different levels of colonial officialdom, but also emerging Indian public opinion. You may have heard of Tarokanath Ganguly and Ramkumar Vidyaratna, who wrote extensively about this in the late 19th century. The single women who migrated to cities and mines were stigmatized. Their opportunities of employment shrunk as industries and mines began to expel women from their workforce in the 1930s. But the plantations were stable employers of women. They continued to have almost half of women in their workforce. But the issue of women's ability to migrate singly to these sites of production came under serious challenge at the turn of the 20th century. The denial to women the right to consent to labor contracts invoked the sanctity of marriage and family authority. Even though evidence spoke of both coercive and voluntary migration, women migrants were characterized either as victims of force and fraud or as immoral women asserting an illegitimate agency. There can be no doubt that narrowing economic opportunities in the countryside and the closing of escape routes from oppressive marriages had reduced women's options. The opportunity for plantation work in Assam or overseas in these circumstances offered a route of escape. At the end of the 19th century, this issue became a big controversy. A new act was passed in 1901 which sought to settle this question, and it settled the question against women's freedom to migrate. In law, marriage was to be deemed a contract. So far in social reform discourses, it had been said that Hindu marriage was a sacrament and not a contract. But in labor, migration law, all marriages, including Hindu marriages, was a contract, which precluded women's entering into any other contract for labor without the consent of their husband or male guardian. In the next 2 decades, the issue of family consent was a constant source of controversy and irritation. Legislation did not always prove effective in deterring women migrants. Nevertheless, an important principle had been put in place. Let's now look at the third issue, which is domestic and sexual labor in this context. So the significance of connecting marriage to labor is threefold. It is the primary means of circulation of women. Marriage is the primary means of circulation of women. We look at the transactional character of marriage. And third, it is proximate to markets in domestic slaves, servants, and prostitutes, and or sex workers, which we have already kind of half indicated. The problem, of course, is we don't know a great deal about any of these trades. Shopna Banerjee, for many years, was the only person who had done a historical study of domestic workers. Now we have 2 volumes of servants' pasts, but it's still a drop in the ocean. What we know in terms of just solid information is that from the census, we know 1891, there were 53 lakhs in domestic service, which was 3.9% of the total population. Calcutta had highest proportion of domestic work employment, not surprisingly. In 1901, this was more or less the same, 4% of the population. In 1911, in the whole of India, 15% per 1,000 were supported by domestic service. So it was quite an important occupation for people. A major change was noted in 1931. For the first time, an increase in domestic workers happened, which was very dramatic in Bengal. And the number of women among servants began to expand more than servants generally. So there is the beginning of feminization. But until 1980s, in the All India context, men outnumbered women among those who reported domestic service as their principal occupation. But women were as much as 6.5 times more among those who reported domestic service as their subsidiary occupation. So this is a little tricky. In the 19th century, domestic work was therefore both a male and a female occupation. And it is only well into the 20th, almost the end of the 20th century, when it began to feminize in earnest. The ubiquity of transaction that characterized marriage brought marriage into proximity with trafficking. There is considerable evidence in Bengal, for instance, of trafficking in brides in ways that render various streams of trafficking of wives, prostitutes, and slaves virtually part of the same process of circulation of women. For the colonial state, the real difficulty lay in policing the boundary between domestic realm and public trafficking. Radhika Sinha has written extensively about this. It indicates a dangerous fluidity at the boundaries of the household. The constitution of the domestic through personal laws created more fuss around marriage and slavery. The existence of secondary wives, often synonymous with dasis or madis, concubines or slave women, was upheld as legitimate practices of polygamy, signaling these continuities. Moreover, these terms conflate the labor of wives and domestic slaves with overlapping functions of productive and reproductive labor. This is really the key this is the point I want to underline. The control over wives and female slaves had similar imperatives. In the early years of colonial rule, magistrates often restored absconding women to men who claimed them, even if they were brothel keepers or managers of dance troupes. Later, the courts refused to intervene, and they usually set such women free. Muslim men often went through a form of nikah to retain control over female slaves, rendering marriage a cloak for slavery and an instrument to retrieve runaway slaves. Similarly, complexities of definition disabled legal action against concubinage. In law and practice, domestic slavery covered a gamut of familial relationships, including marriage, which confused exchange of women, supposedly the foundation of marriage, with transactions in women, supposedly the foundation of slavery. Indeed, exchange could be simultaneous with or preceded or followed by transactions. We know about bride price and dowry. Indrani Chatterjee has argued in her work on slavery that sale and purchase were not antithetical to notions of kin constitution. Thus, slavery was in fact folded into kinship. In South Asia, Andrea Major shows slavery is not always marked by social death. In fact, widowhood, is marked by social death more clearly than slavery. So these reinforce the image of slavery as domestic, but also suggests the opposite, that domestic relationships were similar to or resembled slavery. Thus, abducted women were sold into actual marriage, not as the colonial state believed in the pretext of marriage, but because it was like marriage. The difficulty of policing the zenana meant that the state was unable to control trafficking in women and children, whether for marriage, domestic slavery, or sex work, or indeed indentured labor. The Indian Penal Code was ineffective in curbing these trades. Trafficking in women and children expanded and became more clandestine by the end of the 19th century. The trafficker and the arcati were not entirely different. The network of abductors across the country overlapped with other forms of coercive recruitment. So, this is the crucial connection. Labor agents for plantation recruitment became associated with child stealers, became known as man stealers or man sellers. All these forms of labor mobilization operated in a connected market. Generally speaking, the connection between trafficking and domestic relations, gender and generational, was a constant theme throughout the colonial period. I have argued elsewhere that women's labor was recruited through marriage, and this was true at many registers in the 19th century. It has one meaning for peasant and artisan households. It has another meaning for mines and plantations. And it has a very different third meaning for domestic and sexual labor. I will stop there. And I'm trying to stop sharing my screen.
It's done, ma'am. That was a wonderful lecture, ma'am. It gave a really deep insight into the lives of women laborers in colonial India. It is a very rare topic, and we got to learn a lot of things in this lecture. With your permission, we will like to take the questions now, if that's okay.
That's fine, yeah.
Ma'am, Satkirti Sinha is asking, hi, Professor Samita. I'm a Ph.D. scholar at the University of London, and a part of my research looks at the forceful migration of indentured laborers from Bihar to Trinidad. My question to you is there any possibility that women who migrated to the various plantation colonial lands after the end of the contract did not wish to return back to India? There are many men who, despite the end of their contract, did not wish to come back to India from Suriname and Trinidad.
Yeah. Shall I answer?
Yes, ma'am, please.
Satkirti Sinha, yes, that is very true, and there has been some writing on this. It is argued there is a big debate, like for indenture recruitment, there is a debate at the Indian end. There is also a debate about what happened to these women once they were recruited and they went off to the plantations, whether in India or out of India. And some historians have argued that, in fact, extracted from caste and other relations in the Indian village, these women gained freedom. They gained some, if not freedom as an absolute, they gained some agency. And they were able to forge new and different lives through wage labor. And some have argued that plantation work was extremely exploitative. It meant sexual as well as labor exploitation. And of course, we know that there were waves of wife murder in many of the West Indian colonies. So there was both, I would say, empirically, these are two very contrasting theoretical positions. Empirically, I would say there was a bit of both. There were some women who were able to grasp agency and make the best of the plantation conditions, and some women who were further victimized. But yes, to your fundamental question of whether women chose not to return to India, of course, many women chose to remain, and that is how the diasporic community has been, flourished. Yeah.
Ma'am, the next question is from Amin Longshar. How different is human trafficking among the modern women among the women during the colonial period and the 21st century?
Different. Now there are many axes by which you can look at similarity and difference. So of course there are continuities, which I emphasized in today's talk, but there are differences also because there is now an international market, a thriving international market, and trafficking has taken dimensions that was not there in the 19th century. But in terms of the basic operational, the way trafficking worked in terms of at the point of origin, the fundamentals I don't think have changed all that much. Society has changed. So, for instance, we did a little project in 2018, 17-18, looking at trafficking in South 24 Parganas in West Bengal, as it is happening now. And one of the things we found is that young girls are targeted for trafficking. Of course, there was no young girl in the 19th century because women were, no unmarried young girl. There were young girls, but they were already married or widowed. So it was the nature, so the relationship between these girls trafficking, in which they were embedded was different. So they were already embedded in marital relations, whereas now you can target young women in their natal homes who are not already married or widows. So that does make a difference in the operational means of trafficking. But many of the one would have thought society has changed so much and trafficking and modes of trafficking would be altered too. What is striking to me is the continuities, because we don't regard the continuities as important as much as we should.
Ma'am, the next question is from Shornita Mojumdar. Thank you, ma'am, for this nice speech. As we know, within the northwestern province, vision of industrious criminal tribe families, adult women were expected to work both on household and agricultural tasks. My question: was the toil of women labor inevitable for the transformation of the criminal tribes in late 19th century India?
Yes. Now, one of the things I'm trying to do here is to break down the differences which we often impose on different kinds of labor. And we think of some kinds of labor as labor and other kinds of labor we invisibilize. So when people work for wage, when people go to a factory and work and receive a wage, we think of that as labor. But when people work in the home, whether it's domestic work or it's agricultural work, these tend to get subsumed under unpaid domestic work, which is not treated as work. And that is, in fact, the binary I'm trying to challenge. So I'm trying to argue that all women worked in different kinds of labor. A great deal of that labor was subsumed within domesticity. And I would say that is exactly what we are looking at among the criminal tribes in the Northwest, or indeed in broader society in the Northwest. Prem Chaudhary, in her work on Haryana and Punjab, has shown how important women's labor was to agricultural households in that area. And of course, this would be equally true of criminal tribes. Though for criminal tribes, and especially for tribes like entertainment, tribes which were engaged in entertainment industry, which is also work that some little bits of work has been done. We still don't know enough. Women's labor could be quite central to the way household labor operated in that kind of a setting. We know Subir Rana has done some work on criminal tribes in Bihar, for instance. Northwest, I'm not so aware of any particular piece of research, but I think there is continuity in these.
Next question is from Debushmita De. Uh, Hello, ma'am. My name is Debushmita. I did my PhD on indentured laborers of Mauritius, and women indentured laborers were a part of my work. During your lecture, you said that marriage was one instrument of recruitment. My question to you is it possible that women themselves were aware of such forms of recruitment and they agreed to such forms so they won't be associated with the stigma of being single women?
Absolutely. The answer to that question is a resounding yes. I do think I've found a lot of evidence that women often were completely aware, they participated in these, because, as I said, um, indentured migration for women was often an escape route from conditions which were very bad in village India. And to me, it is very interesting to read Kuli Kahini in that context. Though Kuli Kahini is not about in overseas indentured migration, it's about Assam migration, but the stories are very similar. So, what is Bidaratno portraying in Kuli Kahini? That this woman, that a woman recruiter comes to a peasant woman, Adormoni, and says that your life is so terrible, you are in such you have made to work so hard, so come with me and I'll take you to a place where you will be paid a wage at least for your work. Here you work hard, you don't get anything. So this is kind of you know in Kuli Kahini, Ramkumar Vidyaratna is telling us this story to draw our attention to the terrible consequences of that decision by Adormoni. But the fact that even he feels that this is a plausible argument, that to a peasant woman, an argument that, let's come away with me, leave this behind, let's go somewhere else where life is different, is an attractive argument. So yeah, I think yes. And in fact, I have evidence that there are cases like this.
Ma'am, next question is from Aditya Shankar. The question is, ma'am, we find the character of Bhanumati in Vibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay's novel Arunnak. She was a tribal woman, later migrated to tea garden as a labor. Can you say something on such instances of forceful migration in 19th or mostly 20th century Bengali literature?
Yeah, I mean, Bengali literature is replete with, so starting with Kuli Kahini is perhaps the first of these major portrayals. Then you have Tarashankar, from which the film Shaptapadi is made. Though in Tarashankar, the story is not about tea plantation. In the film, that detail is changed to make it about tea plantation. But then you have a lot of stories, a lot of portrayals. The real question is that last line that you write, instances of forceful migration. What is forceful migration? Forceful migration can be of many kinds. You can think of forceful migration as actual physical force, violently you're kidnapped and abducted and taken, or you can think of being fooled like Adormoni, you can be persuaded by false information or seduced or whatever, or as Debashmita pointed out, you can willingly so you can be married and taken off. In all these cases, so there is that element. And then there is the element, as Debashmita pointed out, that women are willing migrants. Now, in the portrayal, in literary portrayal, we don't get willing migrant. Women are not given that agency. It is almost always forcible. But that is not the truth. There is forcible, but there is also willing. And that willing element in migrations are for women are not often portrayed in literature. And that is the interesting part of the story. It tells us about patriarchy's construction of women's migration rather than how women's migration actually happened.
Ma'am, the next question is from Jhumpa Bosch. Wonderful speech, ma'am. Did the colonial government take any special facilities or policy for the women who worked in the factories in Bengal during the colonial period?
Yes, they did. So I have mentioned the Act of 1891. Previous to 1891, there was the Act of 1881. And then there was in a series, 1911, 1920s, 30s, there were a series of legislation which did regulate working conditions for women in factories. That's the beginning of factory legislation, which then after independence becomes far more um, 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 expansive. And the laws that regulated particularly conditions of women and children, not the whole workforce, are called protective legislation. So you have a history of protective legislation in India from 1881, and we still do. Maternity benefit, for instance, is a specifically a legislation, factory legislation for women. Night shift. There's a prohibition against women working at night in factories.
That I believe was the last question, ma'am. It has been a wonderful experience for us to get to listen to this discussion today, and we are very
Thank
grateful to have this opportunity. Thank you so much, ma'am, for accepting our invitation, and thank you for answering the questions from our viewers and providing such an informative and reflective lecture on a part of colonial history that is rarely talked about. We also want to thank our viewers for today and for tuning into this lecture. And we'd like to request them to stay tuned for our next lecture on 11th of July.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, ma'am.